Welcome to CyberJA, the place where we discuss all things cyber security and GRC. I am Richie Perry, your cybersecurity and GRC enthusiast. In this video presentation, I'll be sharing with you the best practices for ISO 27001 implementation. And before we get into the actual best practices, let us first have an understanding of what the ISO 27001 is all about. So the ISO 27001 is an international information security standard that sets out and specifies the requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an information security management system. For short, ISMS. The ISO 27001 provides it's a systematic approach to the assessment and treatment of information security risk. Right? So the requirements set out in the ISO 27001 are generic and are intended to be applicable to just about all organizations, regardless of its type, size, or nature. That's very important. Okay, so with that said, now that we have an understanding of what ISO 27001 is all about, let us now look at the structure of the ISO 27001. And the ISO 27001 is broken into two sections, if you want to look at it from that perspective, two sections. And the first one, or the first clause that you have, is clauses 0 to 3. Right? That's clauses 0 to 3. And that looks at the introduction, the scope, the normative references, the terms and definitions. And then we have what is known clauses 4 to 10. These are now the mandatory requirements and required documents for your ISO 27001 implementation. And this is broken into clauses 4 that looks at the context of the organization, clause 5 that looks at leadership, clause 6 that looks at planning, 7 that looks at support, clauses 8 that looks at operation, clauses 9 that looks at performance evaluation, and clauses 10 that looks at improvement. Now there are a number of annexes that outlines approximately 110 to 114 controls that are used within each of these clauses to implement the necessary controls that are required to meet the compliance requirements. So there we have the structure of the ISO 27001. And now let us look at the very important point of this presentation, the best practices that you as an ISO 27001 professional and implementer will now use to guide you in your process of implementing this information security management system within your organization. And the first thing that we have to do as it relates to best practice in helping us in the implementation of our ISO 27001 is to establish information security foundations. What do we mean by that? Now, the information security management has much in common with other major initiatives that organizations may undertake. So before starting any activity, it is a good idea to decide which form they should take, their time frame, and the personnel's involvement. The very first initiators involved should be a subject matter expert and top management. They must set up the basis for all other activities. right? So implementing this first step requires the involvement of your top management, who should be accountable for establishing the information security foundations. And responsibility for this task lies with the information security manager. System owners and information owners should also be kept up to date on the progress of task involvement or task development. Secondly, right, assign roles and responsibility. Now, in every business and for every activity, it is essential that you have properly assigned roles and responsibilities in place. Right? So startups or small business or small organizations often view information security as a self-standing process and one that does not depend on their involvement. And some tend to ignore it completely. Right? So when deciding to take measures to define or revise information security management within an organization, it is important that you define and formalize roles and responsibilities before progressing any further. All subsequent steps have typically involved roles with their RACI, that is responsibility, accountability, consulted, informed roles, right? So the main roles and related responsibilities for information security management are generally or should be generally outlined prior to the implementation of your ISO SMS. Very important that everyone understand their roles and responsibilities in the process. Thirdly, you want to understand what must be protected. What must be protected? All right, very important. What must be protected within the organization? Right. So before applying any information security measure, an organization needs to get an initial clear view of which objects really have value for, or which of the objects within the organizations are very valuable, very worthwhile to protect. And such objects or assets usually defined, right, can be generally classified accordingly within the organization. So it's during that asset classification exercise, then you are now able to determine what is of value, what has the highest risk, what's more valuable to the organization, so that you can now implement the necessary controls to protect those assets, valuable assets, normally referred to as the crown jewels within the organization. All right, fourthly, you want to identify what information is used. What information is used. And it is useful to build an asset map, right? Starting from your intangible assets, and that is the, for example, the organization's information. And you could also use a top-down approach, right? Or even a bottom approach to this working out or deciding what information is best, or what information is used. Right? The fifth thing that you want to do is to identify which other assets are used. Right? Identify which other assets are used. Now, identified information can be stored, it can be processed or transmitted using several other assets, mostly but not exclusively technological. Right? So those assets are usually layers of software which run on information systems, but can also be paper files and disk or services provided by external service providers. Right? You want to look at understanding the connection between information and other assets, that understanding the connection between the information and the other assets within the organization. Right? So once all key assets are identified, establishing which ones are used for certain information is a simple but effective way to understand what needs protection and later on how much protection it needs. Right? Then we look at evaluate information security risk. That's the 7 best practice to evaluate information security risk. Now, information security risk assessment is focused on finding out beforehand what can possibly go wrong with the assets and have a negative impact on the cash flow, legal obligations, or reputation of a given organization. And this step is crucial for understanding the threats that the organization is facing so that appropriate controls can be implemented to avoid, contain, or ensure recovery from their occurrence. Right? So by prioritizing risk, each organization can now concentrate defensive resources where the biggest losses are most likely to be caused, and ultimately optimizing the effectiveness of these resources. The 8th best practice is to understand the value of your assets, or understand the value of the assets within the organizations. Right? Now to assess the or to assess the understand the value of the assets, then you have to fully fit the risk assessment process or understand the risk assessment process. Now, one key element should be to an evaluation of the importance of each asset within the organization. And the simplest way to do this evaluation is to start from the defined information and to consider at least 2 of the main security related properties on the information, right? And this could be availability and confidentiality, right? So integrity can be added, but in the simplest context, it can be considered as closely related to availability. So that has to be beared in mind. Right? The 9 best practice is to design, apply, and monitor information security controls. And pretty much in this, a thorough understanding of the environment in which the organization operates is of key importance when defining information security requirements. Right? For example, the EU agency or certain organizations, they develop a cybersecurity threat model, and this can be used to when considering all the likely threats facing the organizations. Right? Now, the applicability of those threats should be evaluated by considering things such as historical incident data available and staff experience. Right? An evaluation like this could at least establish, for example, the following conditions apply to the organization environment. Right? Let's say how prone are the organization's premises to natural disasters or incidents, floods, to power outages, right? And you want to, in step 10, in terms of best practice, is to identify controls to be implemented and set upon an information security plan. Right? So identify controls to be implemented and then to set up an information security plan. And in this best practice, information security controls are the core elements in charge of reducing risk. They can do this significantly if well implemented. Several controls are often already present, but they are numerous and should be considered not just an organizational or at an organizational level, but in most cases also at an asset level in order to identify any protection shortcomings. Right? So you want to identify which controls are already in place. The next best practice is to manage the information security plan. Manage the information security plan. Right? So in managing the information security plan, then once approved, the information security manager or officer should be responsible for periodic or monthly or quarterly monitoring in order to assess whether the information security plan is progressing well and includes the largest possible involvement of other interested parties. Right? So this monitoring should be done through a formal committee. Example, the Information Security Steering Committee, meeting all the professionals involved should report on their progress, difficulties, and changes to be applied to the plan. And the plan should be updated accordingly. And if significant changes are applied requiring new resources, it should be submitted again to top management for approval. We want to control the information security, right? Control the information security. Now, an effective way to verify whether the information security is being correctly maintained is to plan and to do information security audits, which should take place at least annually or as often as required by the necessary compliance standards. Right? So in this, auditors should be selected from among impartial subject matter experts, and they should be tasked with verifying the compliance of information security processes with internal and external requirements. Right? You want to monitor information security. Right? That's to monitor information security. Right? So as it relates to the monitor information security, as soon as the organization is fully aware of what should be protected and how it is currently protected, decisions can be taken about the controls to be newly implemented or improved. Therefore, top management, right, our information security steering committee should evaluate what must be done in order to address each particular risk, along with timing and funding for each solution. And you want to look at steps to establish the information security management system. And that's the last best practice, looking at the steps to identify, right? Steps to establish the information security management system. So in a nutshell, that's where we have all the best practices that can be used, that you can apply to implementing your ISO 27001 within any organization successfully. And remember, as I always say in all other presentations, the information I do present is not cast in stone. Please do further research to ensure that you are on the right path to implementing the necessary best practices that are required for successful implementation of any standard, any controls, anything that you're doing as a security professional. Always do thorough research to be on the right path. Right, so I will see you in future presentations. So there we have it. best practices for the ISO 27001 implementation. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and also to turn on the notification bell for further updates. See you in future presentations.